Okay then, welcome back, guys. Good to see you. Still about a little over 9 minutes until we start today, so just getting the stream going. I need to quickly grab a notebook from my bag in the other room, so about 30 seconds, and I'll be right back. But good to be with you. You're here and watching. Appreciate it, and like I say, be right back. Hello, guys. Yeah, hey, I just had to step out and grab a notebook. Good to be with you, and we'll be definitely starting in about 7.5 minutes. But Jim and Rosemary, Santino, Carson, hey guys, and Santino, yeah, I just responded to your message about your draft, and I'll be able to send back your comments, before the end of the day Thursday. Hey Eddie. No worries. Yeah, thank you. Hey there, Lennon. Leanne, welcome back. Eddie. Eddie's too cute. Okay, we still got about 5.5 minutes till we really get going. He's just a really funny little guy, you know. Hey Eddie. Just to maximize the attendance, I'm going to put another one of those little notes in the Canvas really fast. Okay. Hey, Jasmine. Good to see you too. Hey, Michelle. And Giannis, welcome back. 2 minutes to go, then we get started. Hi, Jennifer. Hey, Karen. Welcome here. Nick, welcome back. Okay, and we got 1 minute, pretty much, a little under a minute. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you guys. Justin, good to see you too. Sandra, hello. Jasmine, good afternoon. And Zach, nice to see you too. Okay, guys, so now that we're pretty much here at 4 o'clock, let's just get things going. Great to see you guys. Hope you had a good weekend. I think I mentioned to some of you maybe when we started the class that I have like some siblings that are triplets. Hey, Tyler and Amanda. So like all three of their birthday was Saturday. So I went out of town to go spend time with my brothers and stuff. And that was cool, but it kind of kept me busy over the weekend. Anyway, it's nice to be home. And here we are. And we'll also welcome Julie. So one thing to take note of, I did post the study guide for the final exam. So next week, we're going to actually have 2 different review sessions on Tuesday and Thursday both. So we're going to use those 2 live streams to just go over the study guide in as much detail as we can. Other than that, let's not forget that your second essay is due in a week, next Tuesday. So you still have another week to work on that, the one that has to do with animals and the animal ethics debate. So try not to wait till the last minute if possible. It's usually good to have some extra time and a margin of time so you're not pressing yourself too hard right up to the deadline. But that's really it. We just have your second essay and your final exam. Now I've posted your study guide and we have the review sessions lined up next week. So the upcoming schedule is pretty clear, and it's all going according to the calendar, so that's nice. But anyway, we do have 2 more lectures this week on one last sort of miniature topic. And so the final thing that we're going to talk about now that we finished up our whole animal ethics lectures is economic justice, whether we have obligations to assist the global poor since we're living in a first world country with a lot of wealth. Do we have any obligations at all to support, provide for, assist the international poor? And that's a question that, of course, not everybody agrees on, just like everything else in this class. So you're going to hear from different authors, but we're going to start on actually Peter Singer. So we read about Peter Singer, as you know, in the animal ethics debate just now. But as a moral philosopher, he's interested in a whole variety of topics in ethics, not just the issue of animals, but also others, including the question of the haves and the have-nots, the economic inequality and disparities that we have in the world. So we're looking today at an author, the author Peter Singer again. And we're taking a good look at his paper that he wrote in 1972, which is called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So just giving you some basic info right there. The author's name, hi Julia as well. Author's name, title of the paper, and the year of publication just given there. So Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer. So yeah, the problem, the topic, the debate right now is economic inequality and the question whether people like us living in affluent first world countries, do we have a moral obligation to provide assistance to the global poor that are living in extreme conditions of deprivation and hunger? And philosophers, as well as, of course, everyday people, have widely differing views on this topic. So the author today, though, Peter Singer, he's going to make the case that we actually do have a real moral obligation to direct some support, financially or otherwise, to the global poor to assist these human beings that are living in extreme poverty. And if we have enough time, hopefully we'll be able to get through all the Singer, and then next time our last author will be Garrett Hardin, who makes the contrary argument that we don't have a moral obligation to the poor, and we'll see the reasons that both of these authors give. So I'm just going to jump right into it and start giving you some facts and data. Now, about this paper, though, Peter Singer wrote multiple different versions of this paper over the generations. This is one from him from 1972. So he actually wrote it when he was quite young, basically, let me make sure I'm getting the facts right, but I think that he was born in 1946. I want to make sure I'm getting that correct. Yeah, he was born in 1946, so for him to be publishing an academic paper in 1972, kind of impressive in a way, because I guess he would have only been 26 years old at that point. But yeah, right, yeah, that's the math. So he wrote it when he was pretty young, but he's updated this paper over the generations. In fact, he wrote another version of it in 1993, which I also sometimes teach. That's in another textbook. So I'm going to kind of integrate some of those stats and figures as well, because he's making the same argument in both papers, but the 1993 version just has some economic data that's a little more recent, even though it's still about 30 years old. But anyway, the overall argument, the logic, and the reasons that he gives are the same in both papers from both 72 and 93. I'm just going to try to help you with some extra context that's provided from later versions of the same kind of paper that he wrote. Now, so he begins by giving us some basic facts about poverty. So a lot of this is just empirical data that's verifiable and statistics that are true. But there's a lot of people in the world today that are lacking the resources necessary to provide for fundamental basic human needs. For example, not having enough income or wealth to just sustain your physical and mental baseline health. And if you're living in that kind of extreme poverty, you're going to be not just hungry, but you're also going to be fighting off diseases and infections, because parts of the world where this kind of economic condition prevails are also places where there's poor public health systems and poor public sanitation programs. So you'd be beset on all sides with difficulty and hardship, close to starvation, struggling to find enough food for you and your family, and fighting off all kind of opportunistic diseases and infections. It's further intensified by the fact that there's also generally sometimes lower literacy rates and just public health agencies overall in those kind of countries. So there's just basically a lot of people in the world that are hungry and struggling. Now, when we hear about the fact that there's many, many people in the world living in this kind of poverty, some of you, or not maybe you, but some people anyway, might kind of be a little bit jaded about that. And they may say, well, isn't that just how life goes? You know, there's some prosperous nations, there's some that are more poor. Maybe some of those poor nations kind of deserve that because they're not working hard enough or they don't have enough of an industrious economy. But the author Singer makes the point that it's kind of hard to take that same sort of indifferent, detached attitude to the fact that little children are oftentimes struggling and even dying in some of these poverty-stricken nations. So it's not just like able-bodied adults that refuse to, you know, build a career or, you know, economic self-sufficiency for themselves that struggle this way, but it's also a lot of little children. And, you know, little children, of course, they have no control over where they're born or to whom or what, you know, society or nation that they develop within. So as the author points out, you know, there's upward of 14 million children that will die each year from lack of adequate nutrition, basically starvation. And that's far from a natural cause because children should be the most vital and healthy among us since they're so early in their life term. But a lot of children die each year from starvation. So he says, you know, that's something that we ought to care a little bit about. And he makes the mention that we in the industrialized first world countries, like our own country, America, we don't really get to see the full scale of human poverty in our own communities and neighborhoods. The poorest among us, there's definitely some. I mean, you're going to be able to find, you know, inner city areas, homeless encampments, tent cities. These things, of course, do exist in some of our cities, and you may have seen some too. But even having said that, Singer points out that there's still levels to poverty, and even the depths of poverty that can be examined or seen in our country, they pale in comparison to the more extreme case of poverty that you would find on, say, like the plains of West Africa, where sometimes there will be human beings that look like skeletons with flies buzzing around them and, you know, vultures waiting to eat them and stuff. So people in our country, even when they're very poor, even when they're homeless, they're generally not skeletonized in that same way. There's enough public health programs and surplus wealth that could be attained by, you know, simply panhandling for money and stuff, that people can still maintain a robust body weight and sometimes even, you know, have a heavy body. So in our country, and then hi, Miana, good to see you too. In our country, even though there is poverty, he just makes the point that we don't see the full depravity and depth that poverty can have. We'd have to kind of focus a little bit more our attention on the international community to see it, at how bad it can really get. Now, he introduces a piece of terminology really fast, which is the term absolute poverty. So I'm just going to put that onto you right now. Sorry, here in the chat. So this term absolute poverty was first phrased by the former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara based on his experiences in international travel. What it really means is not having enough income or wealth to meet the fundamental human needs of three major things: food, clothing, and shelter. So absolute poverty, and you see it there. Not having enough income or wealth to meet fundamental human necessities: food, clothing, and shelter. So imagine that. Imagine that all the money that you have from either your work and labor or your, you know, existing family wealth was not sufficient, was not enough to cover your basic needs, to keep you fed, to have a place to sleep, and to have a set of clothes on your back. That's the real situation of a lot of people living in this planet today. And again, if you're living in absolute poverty, you're living in a severely deprived condition and you're struggling to survive. Now, why is it called absolute poverty? It's called absolute poverty because it's not relative poverty. In our country and in any really modern industrialized country, you can sometimes feel like you're poor by comparing yourself to someone with even more extravagant wealth. So, I mean, I don't obviously know anyone's particular financial situation, but it's probably a fair thing to say that many of us might sometimes feel a little bit poor by comparison to the next man or woman who has even more wealth than us. You may see someone living up on the hill in a nice house with multiple cars. And you might be like, wow, I wish that was me, because right now I can't even spend extra money to go out to like a concert because I got to save my money because I'm, don't have as much income. But that's relative poverty. When we talk about absolute poverty, it's called absolute because it's poverty from the point of view of absolute human necessities instead of just having less desirable luxury things than others. So absolute poverty is really tough, and it provides a lot of misery and death around the globe, and it kills people, including children. So one thing to know about Peter Singer in terms of his moral philosophy, and I think we actually touched on this in the animal topic, Singer sees himself as a utilitarian. And if you're a utilitarian, as you know, your main thought is to do whatever it takes to create the most overall human happiness minus pain. And that would be your obligation at all occasions, to maximize total human happiness. So if absolute poverty is out there, and it is, this is something that is the causing and contributing to the opposite of overall happiness. This is causing pain, misery, death, and struggle. So he says anybody who has a utilitarian frame of mind or utilitarian moral intuitions should think that there's something problematic about this status quo, and it would be better morally if we could do something to improve on it, to make conditions better, etc. Now, how many people in the world are living in absolute poverty? Here we see statistics that were given in the 1993 version of the paper, but he gives the fact that over 1.2 billion people living in absolute poverty around the world. Now, he gave that fact in 1993, and the global population has significantly expanded since then. Since 1993, we probably gained another 3 billion or so people, because right now we're close to 8 billion globally, and back then it was around 5. So if you just update it to, track with the current figures, this could be easily double that amount by now, or getting close to 2 billion at least. So at any rate, that's a lot of people. That's a big percentage of the global population struggling and living in this absolute poverty type of condition. So he makes an interesting point that this kind of poverty condition is not something that we're always thinking about. It's not always on the top of our mind. A lot of us are just focused more on our everyday affairs. And if we watch the news, or if we tune into news agencies, a lot of the domestic ones anyway, they're not really focusing the viewers' attention on the issue of global poverty. A lot of our news media consumption has more to do with like our own domestic political affairs, or even less consequential, more trivial things like sports, celebrity gossip, and entertainment. But the author makes the point, Singer says, that we shouldn't naively assume that everything's going well in the world just when there's nothing necessarily problematic happening in our own country. This global poverty that we're talking about, this is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the real world situation that's going on at all times. And so it doesn't make headlines like maybe an air crash in our own country or something, but if we wanted to turn our attention to it, it would be there for us to see at any given moment. Now, he continues to build his case. He says, you might think, well, there's nothing that can be done because we have a situation where there's too many people and not enough food, not enough resources to provide for the big population that we have on the planet. And if there's too many people and not enough food or whatever, then you might say this is a problem that's unsolvable. Kind of like musical chairs, right? Have you ever played that? If you know the game I'm talking about, you have a set of chairs and there's one less chair than there are people. And then when the music stops playing, everyone's got to try to take a seat, but someone can't get a seat because there's just not enough seats. So by analogy, if there's too many people in the world and not enough food, you might say, well, someone's bound to not get a seat at the table, not eat, or have as much resources as they need. And unfortunately, they'll struggle and suffer. But what else can be done? Because there's no way to fix the problem. But Singer disagrees with that. He says, actually, the problem of global hunger, it's not really driven by scarcity of resources. Instead, it's a problem that has to do with the poor distribution and waste of the available resources. So let me put that here in the chat, and then I'll explain a little bit more. So this is a claim from Singer. Okay, here's just a claim, and we'll break it down. But he says to the reader, if you think the problem of global hunger is just because there's not enough food or not enough resources, he's trying to check that. He says that's not true. Actually, the real fact is that it's a problem driven more by poor distribution and the waste of available resources. So let me go into the point there. On the point of waste, so we, as American consumers, we actually purchase a lot more consumable resources than we eat in often cases. So you may notice even in your own behavior and habits, I sometimes can be guilty of this myself, where you'll buy a lot of food, say at the grocery store, but you buy more than you really need, and some of it goes to waste in your pantry, and you have to just throw it out in the trash, and it goes to the landfill. Or you buy more things than you really need to eat at, say, the restaurant, and you leave things on your plate, and they just get trashed. So we sometimes have a desire to test out more options than what we can actually consume, and that results in some inefficiency in the availability of consumable resources. So if we were a little bit more frugal in terms of the ratio of what we purchase to what we could consume, that would free up some additional consumable resources that could make a dent in the problem. The other thing that he points out, which is interesting, and it kind of connects a little bit indirectly to his other arguments about animals, is that because of the heavy emphasis that we have globally and in the West for sure on meat-based diet and animal agriculture, that results in a lot of inefficiency in terms of the total availability of consumable resources to human beings. Because as studies have shown, we have to divert a lot of consumable resources, grain and et cetera, to the farm animals so that they can be raised for slaughter to become meat for the consumer, but that's quite inefficient. The same amount of consumable resources that are being diverted to these animals to turn them into flesh for us to eat could more efficiently be given directly to humans. And if that was the case, it would free up enough total consumable resources to feed an even larger global population than what we have right now. Now, he's not saying that because he sort of assumes that if we just make a global conversion to vegetarianism, then we'll save the world and the problem of hunger, but because that's not realistic. But he does want to say that we shouldn't kind of comfort ourselves in the false belief that there's nothing that anyone can do about this problem. Instead, he's trying to emphasize that there actually are things that could be done, but we make individual and collective social choices that result in the lack of available resources for everybody. So that means that we're still kind of on the hook morally to maybe try to reform our status quo and practices to make the situation better for human beings. So the poor in the third world could be benefited, among other things, by a transfer of wealth from members of the first world to the third world. So the wealth, the surplus wealth that would be helpful to assist the global poor that are living in hunger, it does exist, and we are some of those people with the additional wealth. So now he continues by introducing another piece of terminology. Rather than absolute poverty, what about absolute affluence? Okay, so now I'm putting that in here. So absolute affluence is just the sort of flip side definition of absolute poverty. What it refers to is having more than enough income and wealth to meet the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. Okay, absolute affluence. Having more than enough income and wealth to meet the basic human needs of those big three things mentioned: food, clothing, and shelter. And based on the way the definition is stated, each one of us lives within the condition of absolute affluence. So in other words, when you have already purchased those basic necessities, you have a place to sleep at night, you have a set of clothes to wear, and you have food to consume, each one of us still has money left over for any number of non-essential purchases that are just more like wants rather than needs. So it's not like literally every last penny that you make is directed to the basic necessities and you don't either have enough or none left over. No, each one of us, we have some wealth and income that we direct towards the most fundamental needs, but we still have money left over to go to concerts, to buy, video games or technology or, expensive additional clothes, to have another nice fit, or all kinds of random things that we buy as American and first world citizens. So we live with absolute affluence. The difference between absolute poverty, absolute affluence is pretty straightforward. With absolute poverty, you don't have enough income and wealth to get up to the baseline of your necessities. But with absolute affluence, you have more than enough. You have surplus wealth beyond necessity. Um, so again, then he kind of raises the contrast between the haves and the have-nots, the two sides of this big economic inequality. There's billions of people living in the world in countries where, so if you're living with absolute poverty, here he gives us a little fact that's kind of a bit stunning. What's the average per capita income of a person who lives under absolute poverty? Well, at least in 1993 dollar terms, here's what we had. So what I say and what's written here is average per capita income of people living in absolute poverty globally is approximately 200 US dollars. Now that's 200 US dollars, meaning like per capita per year. And now, quick point, this figure I'm citing is from the 1993 version of his paper. So certainly since then, there's been significant inflation that's changed the value of the US dollar. So when he says 200 US dollars, maybe being generous, that could be updated for 2025 to be a factor of 2, maybe like say 400 or so US dollars. But even if that was the case, imagine that that was your budget for the whole year. I say to you, here's your allowance, and you've got to get through 365 days, and what you've got is 400 US dollars. It'd be like a little over $1 per day on average to spend. It'd be really hard to survive. Now, when I say that's the average per capita income of people living in absolute poverty, don't get it wrong. This is not to be confused with the amount of purchasing power that the US dollar would have if you converted it to a foreign currency at the rate of exchange and then spent it in that country. Because, I mean, prior to the whole tariffs thing that we're going through right now, geez, the US dollar is pretty strong. It's weakening a little bit currently based on economic facts that we're undergoing. But generally and historically, the US dollar has been very strong. So if you go to like a third world country and you convert it to their currency, you actually usually have a lot of purchasing power. As an example, I've been to India a few times. And when you go over there, when I was there back in like say around 10 years ago, 1 US dollar would be converted to like 60 rupees, which is the currency used in India. And that's actually a pretty good exchange because you can buy like street food and stuff sometimes for 5-10 rupees. So the US dollar goes quite far. But we're not talking about the purchasing power equivalent that a US dollar would have if it was exchanged to a foreign currency and spent there. We're talking about the purchasing power equivalent that it would have in the US economy. So just again, imagine that you had to survive on a little over $1 a day for a whole year in the United States. How would you do it? You'd have to do what people in the third world living in absolute poverty actually do, which is, like band together in big communal, extended family household living situations where everyone chips in their meager amounts of labor and income to then purchase surplus amounts of like consumable resources that can be rationed off, like simple grain or proteins that they can then survive with. But it'd be very hard to do. Anyway, that's the real situation of a lot of people living in absolute poverty. I've had some friends, like from college days and stuff, that after college ended, they went out into like humanitarian aid agency work, like Peace Corps. And one of those friends, they were shipped out to Ghana, which is like a very poor country in West Africa. And they were trying to provide educational assistance in the form of like teaching at a school. And what she reported to me is something that a lot of the aid workers have also noticed, is that when you touch down in one of these poor countries, you're kind of immediately seen as a Westerner because of your appearance, your manner of speech, and your style of dress. And she said that like little children in these villages would just like flock to her, assuming that she had, such extravagant wealth, like maybe she would have toys or candy to hand out. And it's just a sort of example to mention as to how even those of us living in pretty humble circumstances, considered from our own point of view, would be perceived by the members of the international community living in absolute poverty as like having extravagant wealth beyond what they could possibly dream of or attain. So again, we're just trying to highlight here the author's point that there are major gaps in the haves and have-nots globally, and he's just trying to impress that upon the reader. So he says, what if we as individuals transferred some additional wealth over to the third world to make some assistance for the global poor? Couldn't we do that without even threatening our own well-being or basic welfare very much? So he turns his attention to how much is really being transferred from the first world to the third world to try and assist with poverty and hunger. And it's a kind of disappointing statistic that he gives. So the United Nations, in 1993 at least, had a targeted goal for first world nations to try and divert 0.7% of their gross domestic product to alleviating global poverty. So let me write that here. So the United Nations, international body, had established what was seen as a reasonable and achievable goal: 0.7% of the gross domestic product, meaning like 0.7% of the annual economic output of the country, to be set aside for some manner of relief and assistance to the global poor. But how much was really being given, at least when he talked about this in his 1993 paper, in comparison to that goal? Well, kind of disappointing, I guess. Let's see here. I want to get another text with the facts that I'm looking at. So just give me 2 seconds. I'll be right back on that. Okay, guys, thanks so much. Sorry for stepping out for 2 seconds. I just want to cite the correct statistical data about how much was being directed to the cause of this in comparison to the goal that was given. Eddie. You hear Eddie? That's fine. Okay. Yes, sorry. Take me just 1 second. I'm right here. Okay. Okay, yeah. So anyway, back to the point. We say that there was this goal that had been established by the UN, and Singer's trying to point out how deficient we've been in comparison to the goal. So let's go through some of the big nations and what rate of giving they had. So the United Kingdom, Great Britain, right? 0.31%. So that's a little less than half of the targeted goal, which is a kind of modest and achievable target. Let's continue to another wealthy nation, another major first world economy, Germany. How much was given by them? A little better, but still far short of the target. That's 0.41% had been the rate they gave out. Okay, so still less, but a little bit more than 0.31. Japan, another major global economy, but here again, short of the target, 0.32%, similar to UK. And then we come to the United States, the wealthiest country. We're at the tip of the wealth pyramid, wealthiest country in the world or in world history, really, but maybe not the most generous, at least in this one example, because it's 0.15%. So that's one of the lowest rates of giving overall. And I mean, with the dismantling of all the humanitarian aid agencies that we've been seeing in the current administration over the last few months, I wouldn't be surprised if we're getting into shockingly lower numbers even than that. So what he says then is he finds this morally problematic. Given these facts, he wonders, are we allowing more people in poor countries to suffer and starve by not giving more through the assistance that we could otherwise have provided or could provide? Are we making it possible for more people to die than is necessary? And so he starts to kind of raise a real tough moral question, which is, if we withhold assistance and we don't assist, but the assistance would have saved lives, is that on par with killing people? Because if you kill people, obviously, through your actions, you directly end lives. But you could argue that if you withhold assistance, if it has the same net result, then what's the difference? If I drown you in a pool, I'm responsible for your death. But if I see you drowning in the pool already, and all I have to do is extend a hand to pull you up out, but I refuse to do it, it's going to result in your death just as well. Even though I didn't quite technically kill you there, I withheld assistance that would have saved the life. So he kind of ponders this question. He leaves the reader to sit with it and think for a minute. Like, is there any moral equivalence to be drawn between killing and failing to assist the poor? Now, he knows, having said that, that many people will reject the comparison between the two. Because after all, I'm sure most and many of us that don't maybe have any active charitable giving don't really feel like it would be fair to compare us to the moral characteristic of like a literal murderer or killer. But even though he's willing to concede a little bit that killing and failing to assist are not exactly on the same par, he wants the reader to think more deeply about what are the differences then between killing and failing to assist. So that leads us into the next little part of his discussion where he lists out a set of differences between killing and failing to assist. He wants to kind of give voice to his critics' position that there are, after all, some real differences between those two. But after he reports what the differences between, again, killing and failing to assist could be, he returns to his major argument, which is that nonetheless it's still wrong and it's still significantly bad morally to fail to assist, even if it might not be exactly as bad as killing would be. So if that makes sense, we now continue with this next part. What are, say, differences between, on the one hand, killing people, and on the other hand, just failing to assist, say, the global poor? Eddie, come on. Differences between killing and failing to assist. Okay, guys. Everyone's still here? I want to check in with you. Let me hear from the chat. See if you guys are watching, paying attention. Let me know. Okay, no worries. Thanks, guys. Just kind of trying to keep things active. Thank you so much. Okay, so killing versus failing to assist. What are some of the so-called differences here? All right, number one, first difference, he talks about a difference of motivation. Okay, so first difference of motive. And let me explain. So take the case of a killer. It's just a disturbing thing to even think about, but some people, unfortunately, they kill people, you know, like just, I don't know, that's an example, like a mass shooter or something, right? They go out in a public place and they just take people out and kill them. Now, what's the motive behind the killer's action? I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? It's to kill people, it's to end their lives. And that's probably one of the most evil, you know, sinister motives that anyone could have, to want to like be the cause of someone's death and to end their life like that. So that's evil, that's wrong, that's despicable. But let's consider another case. A person like maybe any of us, perhaps, that just doesn't kill anybody, but doesn't provide any kind of charitable donation to the poor. Now, if you or I don't give, say, money to any charitable agencies or organizations to help the poor, what would you say is the motivation in that case? Is it to hurt anybody? It's not really, but how would you put it? What's the motivation behind, instead of giving something to the poor, just spending it on yourself? It's not comparable to the motive behind the killer's act, right? It's just a desire or motive to what? So the killer's motive, killing people, ending their lives. The motive behind failing to assist, yeah, it's just self-interest. It's just to enjoy your own wealth, you know, and the things or, you know, goods or services that you can purchase with your own wealth. So the killer is setting out with a deliberate intent to end people's lives. Those of us that just go to the mall and spend more money on like another expensive outfit or whatever, it's not like when you buy it, you're thinking, haha, I love doing this because it causes me to think about how many poor people are starving instead of getting the money I'm spending on these shoes. You know, most of us, it would never cross your mind at all, like what more noble things you could do with the money that you instead spend on yourself. You just are thinking about the purchase in the first place and what benefit or happiness you can derive from it. So that's one strong difference, perhaps, the difference of motive. The motive of the killer, bad, evil, wrong, destructive of life. The motive of those of us that fail to assist, just enjoy our own wealth and, you know, pursue our personal happiness. You could call it selfishness, you could call it self-interest, but it's not exactly a desire for, it's not a malicious desire for people to come to harm or die. That's one difference. Here's another difference. So here's the way he puts this one, the second difference. It is not hard to avoid killing people. But it is very hard, very difficult to save all the lives that you could save, like by means of giving aid or money, etc., to the cause of relieving some of the global poverty or hunger. So here's a second difference. We're being called to consider two different moral obligations. On the one hand, don't kill people. On the other hand, do assist people financially or otherwise that are poor and starving. But you could say these two are not exactly on the same par. They're different for sure, because if I was told not to kill people, that is so easy. It's easy to not kill people. You don't have to do anything. But if you told me assist people, I might be able to say that's not exactly so easy. That's something that takes more effort, attention, energy, dedication to a certain thing, and maybe money and so on, and time. So that's another difference. The difference in terms of the degree of difficulty of living up to the so-called moral obligations. So to further expand on this point, let me go ahead and make a quick little analogy or example. I'm going to assume something about everybody here watching this that I guess I can't say I know for 100% fact, but I would say it's probably a pretty safe bet. I'm going to just go ahead and assume that none of you guys have ever killed another human being. So hopefully that's true. Anyway, pretend you never killed a person. So question to anybody listening. So far in your life, has it been hard for you to not kill people? Are you struggling like to repress intrusive thoughts of killing people? I really hope not. All joking aside, is it hard to not kill people? No. What do you have to do to not kill people? You don't have to do anything. How many people are you not killing now? All of them, all 8 billion of them. So for you to not kill people, you literally just have to mind your own business and leave people alone. It doesn't take any effort. It requires you to not do something. It doesn't ask you to do anything. It just says don't kill them. Now, on the other hand, if I say you need to assist the poor, you might say, well, that's not the same thing. It's not exactly as easy, because it's not like all I have to do is mind my own business and leave people alone. To not kill people, that's all I got to do. But to assist people, I've got to give time, I've got to give money. I might have to do that for an extended time period to try and make a dent in the situation of helping the poor. So here's another difference. Hard to save people's lives, not hard to avoid killing them, okay? A third difference then has to do with the difference in terms of certainty of the outcome. Certainty of the outcome. Okay, so a little bit of a sort of disturbing thought, but let's go back to the case of the killer. Suppose there's a person who, for whatever dumb reason, they want to kill people, and they have the motivation and the means to do it, like they have a high-powered weapon. Now, it's every time I teach this point in this lecture, it sends a little bit of a chill down my spine, to be honest. But anyway, that's reality. What do you think? If a person did want to kill people and they had the means to do it, what would you say would be the probability that they actually could or would? So suppose someone's set their mind to that and they have the means and the motive to do it. With what degree of likelihood do you think that they could actually and could kill a person? Simple question. If a person wanted to do it, how likely would you say it would be? Pretty likely, right, Santino? Exactly. And I mean, it's in a way sad to say that, but because of the sort of high-powered weapons that are out there and the easy access, at least in our country, that people do have to them, we're all sitting ducks. If these people want to hurt and kill people, they can plan out their attacks. They have the element of surprise. So once shots start ringing out, everyone's already at a disadvantage and they're at a loss. So unfortunately, when somebody really wants to do that and they have access to the right kind of weapon, it's almost highly certain, almost totally certain that they'll be able to kill a few people at least. On the other hand, though, okay, and by the way, I mean, the reason that's disturbing to me is it's because, like, what, am I living at the mercy of these psychopaths? Like, are they going to let me live today? I mean, it's sort of like it's just up to them, right? I have to, like, rely on the grace of all these insane people that otherwise might do harm. But anyway, moving on. If you fail to assist the poor, say you just don't give any kind of charity, which is reasonable enough. Many of us don't for whatever reason. But if you don't, what degree of certainty do you think there would be that, like, some person will actually die because you didn't give to the charity? You might say it's not exactly as certain, because you might have some skepticism or doubt about the effectiveness of the aid agency in the first place. You might say, well, I could have given money, but even if I did, would it really have resulted in life saving? Maybe some of it would have been directed towards administrative and bureaucratic overhead costs. Maybe some of it would have been directed to programs that don't actually have a real beneficial human impact. Like say they build a well in a third world village, but then it becomes a refugee zone and no one's using it. So you could say that, look, if I go out and I try to like shoot at people, it's almost totally certain that someone's going to die. But if I just withhold on like writing a check to an aid agency, it's not exactly as certain that that's going to really lead to material harm or death. It could, but it's not as certain as if I wanted to like, so Singer makes this kind of interesting analogy. He says, if you went out to the third world and you started shooting at poor people, definitely there's going to be some that die. But if you just fail to send out money, it's not quite as certain that someone is going to die because of that. So we have the third difference here just in terms of certainty of the outcome, namely certainty that someone will die either as a result of setting forth to kill them or as a result of just failing or withholding assistance to them. So that's a third difference. A fourth difference then is what he refers to as identifiability of the victim. So identifiability of the victim. In the disturbing case of the killer, you know, they kill people and then they create victims who are now dead because of what they did. And when that happens, tragically, these victims, at least what we can say is we know who they are. Like we know their identities and we know that they're exactly connected to the actions taken by the perpetrator. And that if the perpetrator had not acted, they would still be alive. So when the killer acts, they create victims whose identities are known and are clearly assignable to the choices and decisions made by the killer. But if you withhold assistance to the third world, like again, you just don't give money, charity, etc., to those causes, is there any person in the world that we can say, hey, that's your victim specifically, like this particular person in the third world has starved because you, a randomly chosen first world citizen, failed to assist? See, it's not exactly the same. We can't identify a link between your withholding of assistance and a particular person's death. But if you had killed people, then of course we could create that link and it would be obvious. So there's another difference. The victims of the killer are the clearly known. Their identities are connected back to the actions of the killer, and their death is a result of his actions. But if you fail to assist, even if there are people dying somewhere in the third world, we can't necessarily say, hey, you're at fault in particular because of this third world citizen's death since you didn't assist. It's not like the money that you could have given would necessarily be earmarked to a particular person anyway. So there's that identifiability of the victim difference. I hope that makes sense. And then a fifth and last difference, this will be the last one in this series of points. Let me go ahead and write it out. It's kind of characterized in this way by Singer. So with regard to the global poor, as sad as the situation is, you could make the case that it's not my fault they're poor, even though they are. It's not something that I caused. So you might feel like I don't have a personal responsibility to try and address the problem because I'm not the one who caused that problem. But if you have killed people, then definitely you're responsible for their deaths and it's totally on you and you should be held accountable for it because you're the direct reason that they're dead. So you could say, here's a fifth difference. It's not my fault that the global poor are poor, so why should I help them? But if I kill people, yeah, that's on me, and I'm the one that's caused harm to them, so I should be held accountable for the one. I should be held accountable for the things that I do, but I should not be held accountable for failing to address a problem which at its origin isn't a result of my own activities. So fifth difference, you can always say, quote unquote, it's not my fault they're poor. But the killer cannot say, it's not my fault they're dead. So now we have this sequence of 5 potential differences between killing and failing to assist. And you might be thinking, well, what is Singer doing? I thought he was telling us we do have an obligation, and he does argue that. He's just trying to be very thorough and comprehensive, the same way he kind of was in the earlier essay that we read about all animals are equal. You remember that section where he's like, here's all the critics' objections, and here's what the critics will say, and here's how I'm going to try and respond back. So in the same way here, he's doing that. He's like, many people will read these words and they will think, don't compare killing to failure to assist. How could they be the same? Here are all these differences. But now what he's going to try to do is go back through each of them and to show the reader that even if there are these differences, there's still something that is seriously immoral and wrong about the failure to assist nonetheless. So let me go ahead and try and help you understand what he says with respect to each of those 5. First of all, let's go into the identifiability of the victim thing. Okay, so with the identifiability of the victim, sorry, in his 1993 paper, he offers us this analogy to think through the problem. So suppose that there was a person who sells a consumable product. This is a salesperson, and they sell basically like a foodstuff. That's their product that they sell. But there's a problem with the product because it contains a dangerous chemical. And if you ingest this chemical that's in the product, here's what it will do. It will double the risk that you may contract stomach cancer later on in your life. But the vendor of the product knows that, but they want to sell it anyway because they can make profit off of the sales. So they continue to sell it. Now, suppose that later on down the line, some customer who bought the product and ate it does develop stomach cancer. And they come back to our salesperson and they say, hey, you know what? Shame on you. You're at fault and you did a terrible thing because you sold me this product. And now because of that, I've got stomach cancer. So I'm blaming you for that. Now, what is something that our vendor could try to say to evade responsibility for the fact this person has stomach cancer? And let me sort of help you with a hint. It might say back to them, well, look, I'm sorry you have stomach cancer, but at the end of the day, you don't exactly know for sure that it came from my product because my product never guarantees that you're going to get stomach cancer. It just did what? Can you finish the thought? Imagine the vendor saying this, so you say you got it from my product. Maybe, but also we can't say for sure because the product doesn't guarantee you'll get it. It only does what? Go ahead, chat. Let me see if you got the thought here. Well, it gives you a chance, but not just a chance, even a little bit more than that. I mean, it does increase the risk by twofold, right? But doubling the risk doesn't make it a certainty that you'll get it. It could just be, and now the vendor could say, well, even though my product makes it twice as likely that you get stomach cancer, we can't say for sure if it came from me. Maybe you got it from exposure to some other toxic substance, or maybe it came from your own genetics, and it's just a false positive indicator that you ever took my product. Now, imagine that scenario. Wouldn't it still be wrong, though, that the vendor sold this in the first place, even if we can't precisely pinpoint to whom the risk was materialized? We can still say that it was wrong on the mere basis that what? That it just increases the risk, that it exposes people to additional degrees of risk. That by itself makes it wrong. So, coming back to our original case, when you fail to assist the poor, we might not be able to point out any particular person who we're saying we know for sure that person died because you, for example, didn't give money to the charity. But we can say that even if we don't know exactly who your so-called victim is, we still know that by withholding the aid, you knowingly increase the risk to some unknown individuals of coming to harm, starvation, or death by the failure to have access to adequate nutrition and so on. So he says on par with a salesperson or vendor here, we could still assign significant moral blame to you, even if we can't pinpoint to whom the responsibility of the death falls. Does that make sense? So he tries to show in terms of this example that even if the difference of identifiability of the victim is real, it does not fully eliminate the blameworthiness of failure to assist, because failure to assist, like the salesperson's action, is negligent of other people's well-being and it increases risk to them, even if at the end of the day we can't say with total accuracy who is the so-called victim of your failure to assist. Now, next, we can talk about the certainty of the outcome. Let's get into certainty of the outcome. So there it was said that if you set out to kill, like a shooter, for example, we have sadly a very high likelihood that someone will die as a result. But if you fail to assist, the certainty that someone's going to die because of that is not necessarily quite as high. But he gives another interesting point to report back on that. He says, okay, so let me give you an analogy of two cases. I want you to imagine two scenarios. One, a drunk driver. Person gets behind the wheel drunk, so they're inebriated and they're probably not safe behind the wheel to drive. On the other hand, let's consider a different type of driver, but this time it's a homicidal driver, meaning somebody who's intentionally going to use the car to try and strike as many people in a public place as they can and kill as many as they could. sort of like, I don't know if you guys watch the news that much, but like in December, there was an attack at the Bourbon Street of New Orleans where a homicidal driver plowed into a bunch of people and killed them using a big truck. And that's not even the only time that's happened. I mean, it's happened at the Santa Monica Farmers Market. It's happened at the Venice Beach Boardwalk. It's happened in Nice, France, and in Germany at a big outdoor market. So it's something that can happen and has happened. But at any rate, two cases: drunk driver, homicidal driver. Now, between the two, if you had to choose, which of those two would you say is more certain to cause death and injury? The homicidal one or the drunk one? I see the number 2, but I'm a little confused what it refers to, Jasmine. For clarity, anyone can offer. Yes, the homicidal driver has a higher likelihood to cause death and injury because if they do, it's going to be exactly what they're intending to do. They're going to use all skill and ability to try and, deftly manipulate and maneuver the car into people. Now, that means that between the two of them, there's higher likelihood, higher certainty of death coming from the homicidal driver's actions than the drunk driver. But now, does that excuse blame on the drunk driver's behalf? Does that mean the drunk driver's done nothing wrong? No. Of course, it's still something that is wrong. It's still something that's wrong because it still increases the likelihood that someone may come to harm. Now, one of these two things is more likely than the other to cause death, but that doesn't fully erase the wrongfulness of the second action in terms of it being something that still could increase the probability that people are harmed or killed. So anyway, back to our distinction between killing and failing to assist. If someone's setting out to like try and kill people, well, yeah, it's likelier that people will die because that's what they're intending to do. But if you fail to assist, we could argue that even if the certainty that someone will die as a result of that's not on the same level, it still increases to some degree the probability that that could happen. And therefore, on par with our drunk driver, it's still significantly wrong, even though there's other things that could be even more certain to cause a deadly outcome than that. Okay. Now, the response that he gives back to the motivation, difference of motivation, it's the same example. So back to the homicidal driver versus drunk driver, one of them's motivation is to kill, and it's obviously the homicidal driver. The other one's motivation isn't to kill anybody. Why is the drunk driver driving? Oh, not to worry. Thanks, Michelle. It's all good. I saw that it was homicide, and you probably just added DE again by tapping enter, but it's okay. My question on the top right now is, we talked about difference of motive, right? Motivation of the killer, kill people. Motivation of those that fail to assist, just enjoy your own money and have your own pleasing purchases with that. Between a homicidal and drunk driver, the homicidal driver's motive is like the killer's motive, to kill people, but in this case, just using a car. What's the drunk driver's motive behind getting behind the wheel? It's not to kill people, of course, but what is their motive? Like, why are they doing that? The motivation is based on what desire? To just drive home, right? To like, perhaps you could say their perception is the inconvenience that it would require for them to like wait longer to sober up or to call for a ride service or to sleep over somewhere, right? So in their view, it's like, well, I'm going to engage in this unwise and risky behavior just because I think it'll be in my self-interest to do that. So they're making a foolish decision, but it's based on a perception of self-interest instead of a desire for harm to others. Now, the motivations are not exactly the same. The drunk driver's motivation is not exactly as evil as the homicidal driver's, but to the point, isn't it still wrong what the drunk driver's doing, even if they're not necessarily motivated by a desire for death and injury? Of course it's still wrong. It's still wrong because despite it not being their intended goal to kill people, and of course if they did, it would be something that they didn't choose, or it wouldn't be something that they had hoped would happen, but it's still wrong, isn't it? Because it's still, again, knowingly increases the risk that some people may come to harm, and it's negligent of their well-being. So here again, we see that there's still something significantly wrong, even when the motive isn't on par with the motive of the killer. And if you fail to assist the poor, your motive is not to harm or kill anybody or lead to their death. But if you know that it could increase the probability of such a thing happening, then we could somehow characterize it as, wrong to a certain degree, on par with the homicidal, or sorry, I should say the drunk driver's action. Now, finally, what about the whole point of, let me make sure I'm getting this. Yeah. Yeah, so that it's easy to not kill, but it's hard to save lives. In that case, he says, well, it kind of gets his whole argument wrong because he's not saying that you have to spend all your time and money on a never-ending struggle to save the maximum number of lives in the third world possible. Instead, his standard is just to do something instead of nothing. And judged from that standpoint, he does not think that this is the most burdensome or overwhelming obligation to live up to. And then one more was the whole point that you could say it's not my fault they're poor, but you can't say it's not my fault they're dead if you actually had killed people. Well, he has an interesting sort of 2-point response to that. On the first, he says, well, when we say it's not our fault they're poor, a person could challenge that. They could say, okay, go back through history. And what's the original cause of a lot of these international economic disparities between the first world countries and the third world nations? A lot of it does go back to a system of colonial economic exploitation that was a project of like European imperial powers. And because of some of those earlier imperialistic activities and colonial activities, it left us with a sort of divided map where more, some countries have a lot of wealth and others don't. Now, some of us, of course, are the continuing beneficiaries of what might be argued as like ill-gotten gains that came from the colonial system in the past. So if you see it that way in the larger historical context, you might say, don't we actually have some like indirect responsibility to correct the wrongs that were committed by our historical forebears? But he knows that not everyone will agree with that argument because many people probably for somewhat valid reasons may think, yeah, but even if that's true, that's something from past history and I'm not myself responsible for it. Like, the legacy of slavery, for example, if you had going back far enough into a family tree, slave owners, you might say, well, I'm not at all related to that except for just genetically. I didn't, validate or approve of the institution of slavery. In the same way here, you might say, okay, well, even if colonial economic exploitation happened and I'm like somehow a descendant of that system and I continue to benefit from it, I didn't cause it myself. I shouldn't be imposed with a moral responsibility for sins that were committed by people long before me. If you feel that way, then Singer has a second line of appeal to you, which is that if you're a utilitarian, and he is, he says it wouldn't actually matter who's at fault originally for the unequal status quo that we're looking at. All that would matter is that you're alive now and that you have an opportunity to make things better. A utilitarian doesn't ask who's at fault for the problem that you're trying to improve happiness with respect to. It just says that you have a standing moral obligation at all times to do whatever it takes to maximize total human happiness. So 2 lines of response to that. Either it could be seen as somewhat indirectly our responsibility to fix some of these problems, or even if it's not, who cares whether we caused the problem? It's just a matter of us being able to be on the scene now and take actions that could improve human happiness for the sake of utilitarian moral principles. So with all those rebuttals, I guess, Singer believes that he's played enough defense. He's tried to bat away the critic's argument that there's no relevant moral comparison that can be drawn between killing and failing to assist. So this leads him then to the mature statement of his full argument itself, the affirmative argument that he gives that we do have an obligation to assist. So this is, I'm going to type out the whole argument that he finally provides. He calls it the obligation to assist argument. So it's got 3 premises and then a conclusion. So we're going to go over it. So the article so far, it's kind of been like building to this point where we get the full statement of his total argument. The other stuff we've talked about so far is just kind of context to give the reader a basis of understanding. But now to the obligation to assist argument. So here's the first premise. Premise number 1 says, if we can prevent something bad without making a comparable sacrifice, then we should. So that's premise 1. I'm going to put all the premises in the conclusion first, and then I'll go back through each one. Second premise, absolute poverty is bad. That's like maybe the most obvious of the premises. And then premise 3, we can prevent some absolute poverty without making a comparable sacrifice. So if you put these 3 points together, number 1, if we can prevent something bad without making a comparable sacrifice, we ought to. Number 2, absolute poverty is bad. Number 3, we can prevent some without making a comparable sacrifice. What this leads to is the conclusion, I'll write it here. that basically we ought to prevent some absolute poverty. So there is the sort of condensed summary version of his overall argument that he's been building here. And let me just walk you through the premises and try to make it sound reasonable to you. The first premise says that if there's something bad out there and you could stop it from happening, prevent it, then as long as you don't have to make a sacrifice that is on par with the bad thing, then it would be a good thing that you should prevent it then. Okay. So all that's saying is if there's bad things, we should try to prevent them, but only if it doesn't require a sacrifice that is on par or worse than the bad thing itself. Okay. The second premise and the third then just follow through easily. The second premise says absolute poverty is a bad thing. And the third premise continues by saying we also can prevent some of that without making a comparable sacrifice, basically without making us absolutely poor. So if you could prevent bad things at like minimal sacrifice, you ought to do it. Absolute poverty is one of those bad things, and we can prevent it without making major sacrifices that make us poor. So therefore, we ought to be preventing some absolute poverty essentially through like the provision of some manner of like aid, assistance, whatever, to the third world poor. Now, let me just try to go through the premises one by one, or at least talk more about the first one, because that's kind of like the critical premise. To promote the validity of the first premise, Singer gives an example that's kind of a famous example from his work, so I'm going to tell you about it. The example Singer here gives has to do with a hypothetical scenario. The hypothetical scenario is known as the drowning child scenario. So okay, so to explain in better depth the first premise, let's consider Singer's kind of famous drowning child scenario. Okay, so here is a straightforward little example to think about. Say you're walking around somewhere one day and just taking a little walk, whatever, but as you're doing that, you come across a little body of water. Say it's like just a pond or something, okay? But what you notice as you get a little closer to it on your walk is a disturbing sight. You see there's a little child actually inside the pond, and they are struggling to not drown. They can't swim, and they've just gone a little too far out into the water. So they're like heaving up and down, having a hard time, staying above the water line, and they see you. And once they see you, you're the only person anywhere around, right? You're the only person in position to maybe do something to help. So they start crying out to you, help, help, I'm drowning, I can't swim. I don't want to die, come and help me. Now, suppose in this example, all you've got to do to save this child is like lean over your hand a little bit like this, offer it to them, and pull them up out of the pond. And it would just take you like literally 3 seconds and that very minor little moment of small muscular exertion to just yank them up out of there. Now, in this example, let's plug it into premise one. What's the bad thing that you could prevent in the case given? Pretty obvious, but let's just put it out there. There's a bad thing that you could stop from happening, and it would be what exactly? Let me know when you're ready. Yes, you're stopping the kid from dying from drowning. Okay, good. And in this example, what is the sacrifice, if any, that you would have to perform in order to prevent that death? It's really minor. All it takes from you is what? It's almost nothing, but it just takes the minor energy and like the tiny moment of time, 3 seconds out of your day and a little bit of, that muscular exertion. So here's the point, right? But I want to ask you as a question. If this was the situation, would you think that you have a moral obligation to save their life? Or would you think that you don't have that moral obligation? Just moral common sense. This is not supposed to be a hard question. But if that's the facts that we're looking at, what would you say? Do you have a moral obligation? Morally speaking, yes, of course. Most anybody, he thinks, would agree to that if they just have any moral sensitivity and common sense. Because how could a person be like this? It would take a pretty cold person to be like, help, help, help. And then you're like, okay, no, I mean, you're not my kid, and I don't know how you got in the pond. So, I don't want to waste 3 seconds of time. See ya. Like most of us would probably think that that would be absolutely immoral and impermissible. So here again, you can prevent a bad thing like literally death, and it doesn't cost you much of anything. Most anybody would probably think that in this not type of scenario, the prevention of a bad thing, which comes at such a low cost to you, should be considered a moral obligation. Now, let me make a slight adjustment to the case because Singer does, because he wants to make continue on the point. Let me just modify the scenario slightly, okay? So suppose that when you get up to where the kid is, and he's calling out for your help, he's drowning, right? But what you notice is actually this. In this version of the case, he's a little further into the water. In the first version, all you had to do is lean over a little bit, extend your hand, and pull him out. Now I'm giving you a version where to actually rescue him, all you got to do is you got to wade into the water a little bit. For you as an adult, you can easily just stand in this body of water. There's no risk of death at all. For the kid, though, he's too short to stay above the waterline easily. So now I'm telling you, you got to wade into the water. And it's kind of dirty water, muddy water. And I'm also going to add this detail. Suppose that when this happens, for whatever reason, you're wearing a very, very nice fit. You have a very, very expensive set of clothes on. This could be everything designer. You're dressed to the nines. I don't know why, but you're in amazing attire. And it could be I don't know, if you add up the value of all the clothes, it could be over $1,000 or more, okay? So in this new version of the case, you got to get in there and kind of ruin the nice clothes and maybe lose the value of the expensive clothing. So what I've done is I've just scaled up the sacrifice slightly from 2 seconds of time and a minor muscular exertion to the loss of the value and investment of the nice clothing. If I make it that way, would you say that you still have a moral obligation to save them, or would you say now you don't have a moral obligation? And Singer thinks there's still an obvious answer, but maybe you'll be able to see or think about it. If now you got to lose the nice clothes, still have the moral obligation, good. And he thinks that that's the rational and moral conclusion to reach. Because even if the clothes are a bit more of a sacrifice than the first case, the value, morally speaking, of the clothes, it's not comparable to the value of what? Even if you got to sacrifice those expensive clothes, it doesn't compare to the value of what other thing? Yes, to the life of this person. The human being's life is very precious and valuable on a degree which exceeds, the value of these material things. So even if you got to make a bigger financial sacrifice, he thinks, if you really consider the example, you should probably agree that it's still your moral obligation to prevent their death, even when the sacrifice is a little bit more severe like this. Now, to fully understand premise one more point. It does say if we can prevent something bad from happening without making a comparable sacrifice. So based on that little comparable sacrifice clause, it does at least say that it's not like you have to save the person's life at any cost. For example, what would have to be the situation, according to his argument, where we would not have a moral obligation to save their life? If doing so would cost you what sacrifice? It no longer is an obligation if you would risk your life, if you would die. Okay, good. So if you got close to the pond and you're like, all right, youngster, I'm ready. I'm going to help you. I'm going to get in there and save you. But then you're like, wait, what's that? And you see shark fins all circling him. And then you're like, you see these little red laser beams, and there's snipers on towers pointing down into the pond. You might be like, whoa, okay, I would love to save your life, but there's a problem because by doing it, I think I'm going to lose my own life. And therefore, the value of what you prevent is canceled out by the value of what you sacrifice to prevent it. So, he does say that as long as it doesn't require a sacrifice equal to the bad thing, then it's a net positive to prevent it. So back to the bigger picture, there's people starving in the third world. He's saying we in the first world could direct some of our surplus wealth to alleviate some of their poverty, hunger, starvation, and death. And that if we did it, it would prevent some of those things, but it wouldn't make us poor. So what will we have to give up in order to achieve some improvement on the status quo? It can kind of be variable, but luxury items and things that we have that are not necessarily essential. If we had to make some sacrifice of some of those things in order to make bigger charitable donations, he thinks that that would be morally obligatory. The only thing that wouldn't be an obligation is if you gave so much that you yourself become absolutely poor, but that's not necessarily being discussed because we live in the first world and we do have all this kind of amazing surplus wealth. So that's essentially his argument and how he tries to defend it against all the different forms of objections. We can say a little bit more, maybe I'll say a little bit more next time as we begin about what other objections people have raised against his view are. But the last piece is going to be sort of like a opposing argument against this that makes the opposite case, that we don't have a moral obligation to assist the global poor, and then you'll get balance once again, so you can compare and contrast the different moral arguments. Me personally, I'm much more a big fan of Singer's argument about this, to be fair, than the one that's given by the next guy, who I really honestly don't like that much. But we want to at least give you guys a full range of context, so it's important to get both sides of any argument. Is the next guy rich? He probably is. He's Garrett Hardin. I mean, he's a philosopher, but he's a very conservative-minded philosopher. Honestly, he's kind of like the intellectual architect of a lot of these conservative arguments that are being put forward in a political arena right now, like that it's just America first and we shouldn't care at all about the poverty and deprivation happening in other countries. So it's kind of interesting. You can kind of trace an intellectual foundation to a lot of these commentaries that are being made now to the written work of Garrett Hardin back in the 70s. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. You want to at least understand what the philosophical basis is for those kind of claims. But I do find it to be a very weak argument, honestly. But we'll see it when we get there on Thursday. For now, though, I guess we don't have enough time to really do much more for now. So I think we can probably close our stream. So chat, if you guys want to just say your goodbyes, and we'll be good to go for then. We just got one more lecture, and then next week just review sessions to prepare for the final test. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Juliet, Santino, everybody else, your participation, attendance is definitely appreciated. Have a good one. And, if you're needing anything, just feel free to reach me anytime. But for now, I'll see you then in a couple days. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.